Hi, I'm Andrew Harmel Law. I am a tech principal at ThoughtWorks. My pronouns are he, they. The they is relatively recent because of writing a book. Turns out makes you think a lot about what's going on. But I'm also neurodiverse, so specifically on the autistic spectrum. I've got an hour to talk, although it's probably not an hour now, and I need to press go on the thing. Yeah, there are 54 minutes. So this is something that's super important to me, the topic that I'm going to talk about today. This is the first time I've done this talk, so I would love your feedback. Although I might like after 24 hours might be good, because I'll probably be on a massive come down from all the adrenaline. But I would love your feedback, because this is the first time I've done this talk, and it is really important. Because of probably, as I've learned recently, because of the neurodiversity, I need to stay on topic. So there might be, you'll know that I've got a bit carried away if there's things which I've now discovered are called side quests, which is just me getting carried away and talking about things. So if there's side quests, you know that I've got carried away. Meta-narrative, me talking about me talking, is also a very kind of autistic thing to do. So if I'm talking about me talking, then we might run over, and you need to brace yourselves for late coffee. But also enthusiasm. So I can't turn off being enthusiastic about stuff. So again, if I go too fast, you can literally tell me to slow down, and I will slow down, because I'm really used to it. I'm really trying to go at a good speed. I know that sometimes I can not be very clear when I'm speaking, so please just either do that to me or something, and I'll slow down. But because of this, I'm going to tell you what the structure is. So if you know where I'm going, then you know when I've gone off. Because if you don't know what the talk is, right? I know what the talk is. You don't know what the talk is. If you don't know what the talk is, you don't know if I've gone on a tangent, on a side quest. So therefore, what is the talk going to be? This is the structure of the talk, so you know what's going to happen. This is not the talk yet. This is the pre-talk. The talk's just going. So we're going to start off with part one, which is depressing facts, which I thought might just be me telling you depressing facts. Luckily for me, Kenny and Diana, and other people actually, lots of people have shared things that are true in our world and are not necessarily super upbeat. So brace yourselves, there's depressing facts. Because I'm of the autism possibly, I'm going to spend too long telling you about depressing facts, because they're things I know, and I'm not so great at telling whether or not you want to know these things, so I'm just going to tell you these things anyway. That's part one. Part one is the biggest. Part two is the next biggest. Then I'm like, why is everybody so depressed? Because I will have told you all these things. But I love patterns, and I'm like, because this again is like when people talk about superpowers. Why is this happening, right? Let's sit down and read a bunch of books and figure out why the world is like it is. So that's going to be part two. Part three is the action bit. And it kind of picks up on some stuff Diana was saying, it picks up some stuff that Kenny was saying, it picks up some stuff that other people are saying that I can't see. But other talks yesterday, the actionable part of this, which is what I'm hoping everyone will take from it, is there are some ways to break free from this and change the system. So we'll talk about that. And then, so that's even smaller. And then at the very end, you get to choose your own ending. So if you think you're quite upbeat, you can choose a depressing ending, which we'll probably talk about AI and LLMs. Or you can talk an upbeat ending, which is basically me trying to sell you my new book, which I haven't yet finished writing. So even if you don't pick that option, you know that there's a new book coming, and there's going to be a picture of it at the end, and you can click the link and read the first half of the new book, which is not at all to do with what I'm talking about, but it comes from a similar place that all of this stuff I'm going to talk about. That was good. I didn't waste too much time. So cool. So that's it. Part one, part two, part three, part four. Biggest is the top one, smallest is the bottom one. So we're going to talk about power structures and their impact on software, specifically societal power structures. So I had some feedback before that I should define what it means by societal power structures. Luckily for me, Kenny already put, if you went to Kenny's talk yesterday, it's things like patriarchy, capitalism, colonialism, coming from Britain. There's a lot of stuff we don't talk about, but all of these kind of things which we just accept are true and are there. How these things affect our software, and I mean our code, right? That maybe sounds a bit crazy, so that's why I've got an hour or 53 minutes to talk to you about this. But it's not that strange, because if we think about it, we already accept that things like the organizational structure, specifically the communication structures, right? Because of Mel Conway's paper, admittedly it took Mel Conway's paper quite a long time to sink in. We now know team topologies is a big bestseller. We know if we structure our teams in a certain way, it will have an impact on our code, positive or negative. So I'm going to argue that we could also, if we think about other power structures and other ways of organizing, that will equally have an impact on our code, because it's having an impact on our code right now, and it's negative. But if we are aware of it, my argument is that we can make it better. So let's talk about the depressing fact. I already misled you. This is not a depressing fact. This is me telling you that I went to a DDD Europe keynote last year. And the keynote from DDD Europe last year was by Vlad Kononov. And he talked about how, well, the talk was called the fractal geography of software design, which is a very cool topic, title to the talk. But what he was arguing was that the organizing energy of software, the organizing energy of design, was energy that organized knowledge. And the way that the knowledge is organized in code is a series of nested elements. So because it was a DDD conference, the top level was a bounded context. Other top level elements are available. But within bounded context were services, within services were components, within components were modules, within modules were classes, within classes were functions. So these things are nested. So you've got these things, right? You've got some knowledge which is in a box, and the boxes can be nested. You've got multiple of these boxes because you're encapsulating this knowledge all over the place. But it's not just, that's not design. Well, that is part of design, like putting knowledge in certain boxes. But again, if you remember Dan's talk from yesterday, lots of design, and the hard part, which is what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about, is designing this bit, like how the knowledge flows between these things. Because it's pretty easy having a bunch of knowledge which no one else knows about. But making sure you then share the right bits of it with people is hard. So that's fact number one. Key fact number one, which I'm going to keep returning to. Key fact number one, code is knowledge. And the key thing is that the design of the system, or what Vlad argues for, and which I can very much subscribe to, is that knowledge sharing is affecting the system design, right? Specifically, Vlad argues, and I think there's a book, which I haven't read, because I'm trying not to read too many books. I'm not trying to, that's not true. I'm trying not to read too many books at once. But the whole point of design is around about the sharing of knowledge, right? And the degree to which the knowledge is shared is a degree to, how successful or unsuccessful your design is. And Vlad points out that the more knowledge is shared, the more coupled your systems are. So he's got quite a broad definition of coupling. So what's Vlad's definition of coupling? He says there's 4 types, and these are arranged in order of like most coupled down to least coupled. So most coupled is implementation coupling, where you've got literally the same code copied to 2 different places. Next, most coupled is functional, then model, and then contract coupling. As you go down this list, 2 encapsulated knowledge systems that are contract coupled, they need to communicate, but then the coupling is really low. So therefore, what's irrelevant is the amount of data that passes across this coupling. So Vlad says, if a terabyte of data passes between 2 modules which are contract coupled, they're still less coupled than if 2 or 3 bytes is exchanged between 2 implementation coupled systems, which is a kind of key point. So the data shared is not important, right? But the knowledge that's shared is important. So therefore, his point is, the structure of code is the management of knowledge. It's like a big thing, right? A management of knowledge both in stocks, like Dan was talking about, and in flows of knowledge. And so therefore, good architecture, we all seem to agree, like even though whatever we do changes all the time in software, but the fundamental principles of good architecture is like managing that knowledge. So that's why I kind of like Vlad's talk, and that's why this is the bit underpinning fact number 1, because it's a nice way of thinking about it, right? So good architecture looks at minimal coupling, and minimal coupling is minimal knowledge coupling. That's fact number 1. There's another fact. I think Adam, I'm not sure if Adam's in this room, but I know Adam is speaking at this conference. So, and I don't know if Adam's here. But this is the book which I wish I had read if I was going to read about the next fact. But there's a lot of books and I don't have enough spare time. So the reason I know this book is really good for kind of explaining this next fact is because one of my ex-colleagues, Corny Seitzma, has written a tool for him as an excuse to learn Rust, but which is used, it's an open source tool, and basically it puts in place lots of the lessons from Adam's book, And it allows you to look into the Git history or Git repository history of code bases and see what the history of the code was as it changes, right? And it's super useful. So the book is super useful, so I'm told. But the code is super useful because I can start, because I'm a consultant, I can start with a new client, point this tool at all the repos, and then you can move the slider back and forth. And you can see certain parts of the code base being super choppy, other parts of the code base never being touched. There's views, which is like, who is changing the code? One person always changes this piece of code. You can see all of this stuff. So that's super important. But the history of the code is not just in Git, because I also spend lots of time reading lots of code, and I'm sure you know this too. If you look at code, you can see code right now. You can see the trace in that code of what was known in the past, right? And the code right now, so it's not just the GitHub history that remembers this stuff. So that's the second point, second fact. Code is a record of knowledge. These might not seem depressing yet. They're going to get depressing, don't worry. Code is a record of how we understood a problem, not just in the repository history, but you can see it right now, right? And what's important is, and this is why Adam's book is important, it's not just like the record of how we misunderstood or understood stuff. It's the context where we live right now. It's the landscape where we write our code, right? Because we know if we have to go and implement a feature, and conceptually it's really simple, and then you open up the code and you're like, oh, okay, I forgot about that, right? That happens to us all the time. If you are lucky and you've never experienced this, all you need to do is go and ask even the very smart people who wrote the Java libraries, the Java core libraries. There's a ton of small decisions which they made, which at the time I'm not sure they realized would be massively spectacularly annoying. But everyone hates them. But because like small decisions of how you understand knowledge can have a massive knock-on effect, especially if you write libraries for the core of a Java platform or something. So let's recap quickly. Number one, code is knowledge. Number two, code is history of knowledge. But there's a third power, which is all at play of these dynamics. The third power is related to the fact that the ability to write code and approve changes to code and deploy it and run it is an incredibly powerful act, right? Code can do some pretty bonkers stuff. And that power can be used for both the forces of good or the forces of evil. It can be used intentionally or unintentionally. But the fundamental fact is that code conveys a lot of power, especially these days, right? Like in the old days, I used to work for Sun. You could write code, but I can't launch a website until I've gone to Sun, spoken to the salesperson, raised a lot of money to buy a bunch of servers to then put in somewhere and rack them up and turn them on and plug them into the internet. Now I just give my credit card details to one of the cloud providers, right? This is really not hard, right? And with Lambdas, I don't even, you know what I mean? I might not even have to have any money. If no one hits my website, then I might not even have to spend much money. So it's super powerful. And it's super powerful. It's not just powerful in the big sense that we know about, right? Like all of the stuff that we hear about social media, the fact that there's code powering all these social media sites, the fact that there's code powering like weapons of war and surveillance systems and all of these things, right? And even like some of the nastier parts of the internet, right? There's power in that code which is affecting our society right now, but there's also power in the tiny little things, right? There's power in approving a change request, right? There's power in editing some code. There's power in deploying some code at the small incremental micro level. And we're doing this over and over again, right? And that's how the big ones get there. I definitely don't think that everyone at insert name of some random, social media company here, I know some people who work at these companies, they're not all trying to disrupt society in the negative ways they are. They're just pushing individual changes one at a time, and it's all combining to make some pretty bonker stuff. So let's think about that a bit more. Let's dig into this. This is where it might get a bit depressing. So, there's a blog post by Alberto. I don't know if Alberto's here. Maybe Alberto's here. Called The Rise of the Dungeon Master. I'm going to change the name because Dungeon Master for some people conveys like a nice person who's like hiding behind their GM, Games Master screen and like taking people through a dungeon. I am not going for that feel. I'm going for like the bad guy. So the bad guy is like, so I'm going to call them a gatekeeper. So the gatekeeper in Alberto's blog post is the person who wrote an original piece of software, right? So they work at your companies. They're the person who was there at the start, maybe, or they got given a big, really hard task. They wrote some big piece of code, right? Because they wrote it, probably on their own, probably late at night, or he wrote it, let's be honest, right? It's probably a guy. They know where all of the traps are. They know where all of the stuff they're not so proud of. They know where it's a bit messy and the stuff they didn't get to refactor and fix, right? So they have a deep, intimate knowledge of this, which means they know where all the traps are, hence why Alberto calls it the Dungeon Master, right? So it is a good name, but I'm trying to make this a bit of a negative thing, so I'm trying to play up to my depressing facts. They know where the facts are. So therefore, that means they know where they're gatekeepers to the changes, hence the name, right? They're the person. If I want to change this code base, if I want a feature which depends on this code base to be implemented, we need to speak to the Dungeon Master, this guy, right? Because it's inevitably a guy. We need to go and speak to this person. And therefore, this person has a lot of power. If this person wants this feature to go in, they're like, yeah, I can definitely do that. Even if they know it'll take them weekends and evenings and everything, they can do it. If they don't want to, and I'm sure we've been in meetings, it can't just be me, but the person who's the gatekeeper is like, that's not possible. And because nobody knows the code base in the way they do, then you can't question this, right? This thing is. So they have ultimate power. They've got a lot of power. So gatekeepers are everywhere. The most famous one is Brent in the Phoenix Project. What's really interesting about Brent is that Brent, when I first read the book, when Brent first appears, I was like, I know who this guy is. I know this stereotype. Brent is actually like the hero of the book. So that's interesting. I'll talk about that in a second. But I'm sure we all know Dungeon Masters, right? Hopefully nobody here is a Dungeon Master. I've accidentally nearly become a Dungeon Master once or twice and tried to swerve out of it. It's very easy, and we'll talk about why in the second section, to become a Dungeon Master. But this is the thing, right? Dungeon Masters aren't evil. Like in all of the stories, when you go back with the pre-book or like the books which talk about before the person became, like even like Wicked, right? The musical, there's a reason why the Wicked Witch of the West is like, turns out there was pretty bad bullying going on, and that's why she had the flying monkeys. So there's the same thing with gatekeepers. But this is the thing, when you become a gatekeeper, you become conflicted because you know that this thing is not great. Nobody's having fun looking after a dungeon with all these traps and like orcs running around and stuff, right? But you know if you're Brent and you get rid of that stuff, all of your power goes away. And so you see it all the time, and you can see this kind of stuff, right? You see people where their egos are based on the fact, like, A, understand it, and it means that they're smart, because they are. But B, that they're not, what's my motivation I become less useful or less valuable if I fix this? So they're conflicted. So now we've got some facts. Let's join all these facts together. So, there's another thing. This isn't a side quest. This is meta-narrative. I'm not going to talk about why these pictures are here, but if you are interested in art history, there is a reason for all these pictures. So I'm not going to talk about them. That's meta-narrative, so you didn't hear about it. So yeah, two things. Code is knowledge and code is power, the first fact and the third fact. They're basically two sides of the same coin. Knowledge is power is a thing everybody, there's an English phrase, knowledge is power. There's probably a French phrase. There's probably a similar phrase in everybody's language. There are two sides to the same coin, right? The fact why I think this is particularly problematic for us is the middle fact, which is that if code solidifies this knowledge, both the history of it and sets the landscape for the future, we don't just if a bad decision or an imbalanced decision is made, we live with that now, right? We're not just still. So the historical record is solidifying this power imbalance, right? And the point I'm going to make is that it's not just, it's solidifying, as Conway pointed out, and we now generally accept, it's not just solidifying the organizational structures and the communication structures and who was where writing which piece of code. It's solidifying, I'm going to talk about in a second, societal power structures, other stuff. It's explicitly pushing where maybe you're not convinced. I'm going to prove to you that I'm right in a second. Because this is it, right? There's more stuff going on, hence this picture. So, number one. Surely it can't be as bad as I'm saying. Andrew, you're just getting carried away. Maybe I'm just not so good at writing code. It's true, I'm not as good at writing code as some of the other people that I know. That is why I got promoted. But, because I'm more dangerous than other people in code bases. But I'm also trying to save people from this, right? So, if you don't believe me, there's a really good paper. There are more papers than this, but this is the best paper because it's got some awesome quotes, which I get to put up on the screen. This paper, if you can't see it, is it's freely available. It's open source, I think. It's called Gender Differences and Bias in Open Source, Pull Request Acceptance of Women versus Men. So it's a paper from 2016. As it says in the abstract, biases against women in the workplace have been documented for a variety of studies. I don't think anyone would argue against that now. This paper presents the largest study to date on gender bias where we compare acceptance rates of contributions of men versus women to open source software community. So they looked across all of the open source projects on GitHub at the time. So that's a lot, right? The data set is big. And they were like, our hypothesis is women's pull requests are accepted less than men. Here come the quotes. Quote number 1, surprisingly, our results show that women's contributions tend to be accepted more often than men. This can't be true. This is obviously a terrible study. But this is the good bit. As soon as women are identifiable as women, their acceptance rates get worse. So if I don't know you're a woman, I am, because your code's good, right? So I'm probably more likely to accept your pull request. Unless I know that it's Suzanne making the pull request, in which case, it's definitely not a good pull request. That's weird, right? So this is one of the first conclusions. Although women on GitHub, and others, maybe it's other communities are different. Women on GitHub are probably more competent overall based on the fact that if you don't know it's a woman, then you're more likely to accept the pull request. The bias exists against them, right? That's strange. And I think there's another piece. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. So this is why it's important. The reason why this is important is if we're in an organization, there's all of the organizational dynamics going on, right? Power hierarchies, who's promoted, who's boss of who, all of this kind of stuff, who joined the company at which time, all of these things, right? In an organization, you could argue that all of those dynamics, not the broader societal dynamics, would be having an impact, right? And I could get with that. But these are open source projects, right? These people do not know each other. They have no clue who these people are, right? Or if they do, they think they're, it's a completely different internet personality from the person who's actually submitting the pull request, right? So there's nothing here that's protecting an internal, organizational hierarchy. It's pure societal power structures that's affecting that. If I know you're a woman, I assume that you're less good in your code and your pull request is less good. That's what's happening, right? That's not cool. That's not good. It's just patriarchal sexism, right? Which is coming into play. So that's the next point. Code is not only solidifying knowledge and power, it's solidifying societal power structures. These things are, whether we're conscious of it or not, and there's a lot of stuff, I'll mention a little bit in a minute about unconscious bias, this stuff is slipping into code whether we like it or not, right? And the reason why is code is a written record of what was allowed, what we permitted, and it's not a written record of what we didn't allow and what we didn't permit, right? If we don't accept a pull request, most of the time you delete pull requests, right? Because it's a branch and you don't want too many branches because ThoughtWorks tell you that having too many branches is bad, so you prune and you delete all the branches, right? Which is good. But all of these contributions have just disappeared, right? So the code is remembering, and the code is embedding, and the code is ossifying, which I now realize might be maybe ossifying, as in turning into bone or stone, right? It properly hardens all of this stuff. And it's not just the past as well, right? We know that this is setting the context for the future. So this is where the future stuff happens too. It's setting the landscape of where we are right now, so where even if we want to fix stuff, it's hard because we've left with the legacy of all of this stuff from the past. So, more meta-narrative. This is not a burger, but I can't find a better picture. This is a picture of layers of earth to show things get layered on top of other things. But I can't find a better picture that's free and open source. So that's turf at the top, and then there's different layers of mud. Because the reason that this is mud is because surely, right, we talked about Vlad at the start of the talk. If Vlad's talking about how we should organize code and organize management of knowledge, you would assume that code that is most organized and most structured, that would be the code that would have most power to imbalance power structures, right? Because I've spent more time, I'm like, if I build this thing and then you can't see it, then it's like that, right? So you would hope that's true, right? So therefore, the best place to look for this is you look for the big ball of mud paper, because the big ball of mud paper, which is, again, free and available on the internet, is the complete opposite of Vlad. Vlad's nightmare universe is the big ball of mud paper. So let's look at that. So this is the big ball of mud paper with its picture of a shantytown. Because my question is does code need to be consciously structured to do this, right? What I'd forgotten when I went back to reread this for the talk is it's actually structured like a pattern. It's not structured like an anti-pattern. And it might be a bit passive-aggressive of the authors, but it's got like a real problem, right? So this problem is super relatable. The problem is deliver quality software on time and under budget. So that's the problem which the big ball of mud is solving. That's really relatable. I bet everybody here is probably going to go back to work on Monday, unless there's a public holiday where you live. Germany, there's always public holidays. And this is going to happen, right? This is happening to everybody right now. So what's the solution? Focus first on features and functionality, and then focus on architecture and performance. Right? We do that. I do that all the time. That's what everybody does. So this is sounding a bit scary, right? This is where the depressing facts start coming. So that's not necessarily, those are the problem and the solution. That's not what causes big ball of mud. The thing that causes big ball of mud are some forces that they list out in the paper. There's 3, which I think are super interesting. Number 1, the first force is skill. Counterintuitively, they argue, and I've been paying attention to this for quite a while, and I think it's completely true, big balls of mud do not arise because people don't know how to write code, and it's not because people don't know how to do architecture. Big balls of mud arise because some people are really freaking good at writing big balls of mud code not on purpose, but they can, this is why I'm a bad developer. I can't hold tons of information in my head all at once, so that's why I love TDD. It's probably why I ended up working at ThoughtWorks. But some people are really good. A lot of us developers are really good at holding all this stuff in our heads, right? If you can do that, then you can navigate a big ball of mud. I can't navigate big balls of mud because I can't, even with all the IntelliJ, support and all this stuff and LLMs explaining it to me. I'm not as good at it. Other people are. Some people are good at this stuff, right? Number 2, these people, I was going to say get away with it. These people, this works because of factor number 2, visibility. In the real world, if you asked me to build you a building, and I built you a building, and it had a pretty dodgy architecture, it looked really bad, you would be like, wow, that's not a good building. I am not paying for that building. So you can see that in the real world. You can also probably see, Rebecca Parsons, who's our CTO emeritus at ThoughtWorks, she talks about how she'll go into a client, and then she'll be speaking to the CTO, and she'll be like, I bet you've got, which team is that, and which team is that? Or who's sitting over there, and who's sitting over there? And she's like, I think you've got problems between these 2 parts of your software based on who's sitting with who at lunch. And it's a joke, but it's true, because it's basically Conway's law. We can see that if we look a bit harder. The only way to see you're running architecture is to look at code. Not everybody can read code, right? That's the only way to see it. Definitely don't look at the diagrams on the wiki, because if anyone ever has a diagram on a wiki which is actually related to what's running in production, then that's a miracle, right? But this is even worse. So it gets worse. The reason it gets worse is because you can't see it, the person who wants the features and functionality doesn't see that it's stuck together with sticking tape and glue, so they tell you to ship it, right? So it's not, and if you're like, but I need to do this other work, which is refactoring work, right? But the product manager, let's blame product managers because why not? They told me to ship it because I can ship it and we'll fix it later, right? So it can be shipped. Who cares what it looks like inside? The third one is they call complexity, but I know this is a triggering word for many people in the current audience at the moment. So I've renamed it complicatedness. Because code is a record of knowledge, your code tells this story. You can see this, right? Again, nothing gets complicated. No one writes complicated code on purpose. But this stuff builds up, right? This complicatedness builds up. But it then also, like I keep saying, and this is in the big ball of mud paper, and it's in loads of other places, it's setting the context for what's going to happen in the future. Because it's complicated, it's hard to change, right? Because it's hard to change, and I want that feature right now, what I'm going to say is, look, I know, what's the simplest thing that we can do? The simplest thing we can do is we get the gatekeeper guy, the dungeon master guy, because it's a guy, to come in, and he will tell us how he can build it, and he will build it using unrestrained communications. He will just make it work by pulling all of the bits together, going for the worst kind of coupling that Vlad talks about, so Vlad's probably spinning in his grave at this point. He's not dead. But Vlad's getting very upset about this. But we get the feature and we ship the feature, right? And because that happens, the system erodes even further. So this is step by step, and this is all of these things, right? So let's think about what happens as a result of this. Number one, this is another depressing fact, and this is totally true. People regard working in these code bases, I bet 90% of you here have at least one code base at your work, which is a big ball of, because everybody has big balls of mud. Everyone seems to treat it as normal. It's not normal. Well, it is normal based on like statistics, but it doesn't have to be true, right? But everyone just assumes this is how it is. And this is why people become specifically skilled, right? This is a societal kind of bigger picture stuff. If you're good at this, then you'll do well. You will ship features, right? If you're working on the edges of this, right, then, and you still want to do good work and still want to do good architecture, but you can wrestle with the complexity and wrap it up and parcel it off, then that's good, right? So you get people who are specifically good at swamp guiding. And that changes the character of the organization, because the organization will start to value swamp guides and architects. This is a bit weird, because normally, like, I'm writing an entire book which says that architects are need to change, but this drives architects out. So maybe it's not all architects' fault, right? And these are swamp guide engineers are on their way to become, you guessed it, they're on their way to become gatekeepers, right? But that's another key point. Not everyone is becoming a gatekeeper, right? And that means the end results of this, the power is not evenly distributed. The power that is this code and this knowledge is not evenly distributed. And so this is happening, but remember, the code is remembering all of this stuff, the code is embedding all of this stuff, and the code is ossifying all of this stuff. So if you have a tendency towards it, the code is helping it get stuck in, right? And the point that I've hopefully just made is that even no structure code, probably the most bad is the no structure code that makes it even worse, right? And in those kind of circumstances, you see less evenly distributed power. And it's the power to understand things, obviously, because the gatekeeper knows where all the traps are, but it's also the power to change things. So it's both of those powers. So now we can look a step closer. We can step outside of, hopefully I've spent enough time boring you about technical stuff, which you maybe already know about. There's another famous paper, which is definitely worth reading. This is completely unrelated to source code and to software development at all. But what I want to do is take a step out and say, like, does this all resonate when you go into the social sciences, right? So Kenny has already paved the road for me to talk about this stuff. Let's look outside the world. One of the classic papers, again, if you probably speak to Kenny's wife, she will tell you many things that you can read about all this stuff, but this is a really interesting paper. This is called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, and it's written by Joe Freeman, and it's Joe's experience of working in structureless groups in the 60s and 70s in second-wave feminism, right? So what they were trying to do in second-wave feminism was question and find alternatives to and disrupt the traditional patriarchal power hierarchies, capitalist, colonial power hierarchies, right? That was the whole goal. So they got together in lots of these structuralist groups. And what they were doing at the start was consciousness raising. They were just talking to each other and sharing experiences and telling each other what it was like and saying, oh, I didn't really like, I share that experience, etc., etc. That went fine. But then they realized that that wasn't changing enough, so then they needed to take action and do stuff. So then the focus of these groups that Joe is a member of, and she describes this in the paper, they then start doing things. But what doesn't change when they start doing things is the structure of the group, right? The groups are still structureless. Joe's point is that structurelessness doesn't exist. So what does exist? The key point she's making here, the first point, the idea of structurelessness does not prevent structures, but it's just informal structures that appear. Formal structures, like if it's structureless, if you say, let's have a regular meeting and we'll have some minutes and there'll be a chairperson, that's formal structure. So someone can say, no, we're not doing that. That's not how we run things, right? But informal structures are still appearing, right? And therefore, and this is our key point, structurelessness is becoming a smokescreen for the strong or lucky to establish unquestioned hegemony. I should have. Hegemony, thank you very much, that word. over everybody else, right? It's masking. So there is power is being redistributed, and it's not even anymore, right? Because now we're doing something. So some people are acting and taking stuff, right? So it's now, the smoke screen means it's masking these informal things appearing, right? And the people who are taking this power are elites. So elites is a massively overloaded word now. Apparently elites are what Brexit was a response against, and elites are what America is tearing themselves apart over, et cetera, et cetera. So elites, so I don't mean any of that. What I mean is, what Joe is talking about is, what does it say? They're just a small group of people who have power over a larger group, right? That sounds less dangerous. It's just people, right? Nobody's the bad guy. They are not conspiracies. She makes very clear in 1970 something. So before people get, fall off the internet and just figure out that birds aren't real or something. She's not saying it's anything to do with it. But what is a group? So an elite is a small group of people who are power of the thing. Elites are nothing more, nothing less than groups of friends, right? So that couldn't be less exciting if you thought about it, right? But the key thing is, should again, like your Conway's law sensor should be bleeping, flashing red, right? These friendship groups, why are they having power? All they're doing is they're networks of communication. They're just people talking to each other. So it's what we call back channeling, right? They're just back, so some people know more than other people because they're talking to each other, not just in the meetings, outside of the meetings, right? So how do you become an elite? Because in an ideal world, this could still be okay, maybe, if certain types of people got in the elite. Let's see who ends up in elites. Unfortunately, the people from a certain background, white middle class, personality, bit louder probably, or allocation of time, probably don't have kids, or people to care for, that makes you in a group, right? So you've not done anything bad, you've just been you, right? Or Kenny's point from before, if we're outside feminism, maybe men, right? White, middle-class men. So you're just in the group. You didn't do anything, you're just in the group. Unfortunately, what it doesn't include is, for Joe's point, and we can obviously map this to software, it doesn't include your competence, like your ability to think and act in a feminist way, your dedication to feminism, your talents, like, for example, so Joe talks about the ability, access to photocopiers and ability to make cool flyers, which people think, do activist stuff, or stand up and talk to people, or all these kind of things, right? Or any potential contributions to the movement is just who you know. And so this should sound familiar, right? This is what's happening to us. This is how gatekeepers, all of these things start appearing. Nobody's doing it on purpose, right? But you've got certain skills, and you've got certain, you go to lunch with certain people, or you can work late, or you can go to the pub, if you're British, Scottish especially, like going to the pub, right? So these things are happening by accident because of society, because how society works, right? And these in-groups and out-groups are appearing. Right? So that's the end of part one. I told you part one was big. We're going to speed run through the rest, so don't worry, because if you're like, this is going to go way over. This is consciously big. So end of part one. This is the Eye of Sauron, by the way. That's, if you're wondering, that's because it's like some now Diana gets it. To be very clear, someone else said this yesterday, I can't remember who. Code, I definitely, obviously, I think it was Kenny, code is not neutral, right? Right? It's the complete opposite, because as I keep saying, it remembers all of these things, it embeds all of these things, and it ossifies these things, these power structures, these societal power structures, right? It captures, whether we like it or not, unless we think about it, that's coming up, it captures all of this stuff in the code, right? All our frailties, all our biases, all of our just how we are as human beings, right? So it can happen, whether it's accidental or forced or intentional, right? If you wanted to be a nasty person, you could definitely be a nasty person and nobody would notice, right? Like that was a side quest, I'm not going to talk about it. But so this is the key thing. This is what I'm going to trail part 4, because the key thing is human beings are writing code. We're writing code. The code gets written because of us. So we're writing the code. So, that's a bit, I can't just check that I'm saying the right thing. Oh, that's the thing. I'm now going to ask you a question. So maybe you're thinking, oh my God, this could be me. I'm aware that this has been me in the past, so to be very clear, this has been me in the past. But maybe you're thinking, this definitely isn't me. This is fine. Where I live, where I work, everybody's equal. We can all make changes. The code base is pristine. Everyone is living in this utopia. But the reason why I shared all of these things is just to make you stop and think, are you living in a pluralistic utopia? Or are you possibly one of the elite because you can go to the pub after work, or because you have some spare time to set up all the key bindings and learn them on IntelliJ or whatever, or read all the stuff on the wiki? Right? So, are you the gatekeeper? So, but this is the point, and this is really, I was making this point, I'm going to basically, this is one bit where Kenny's talk and mine overlap. So if you were at Kenny's talk, you can fall asleep. We all live in this system, right? Some of us are benefiting from this system. Some of us are not benefiting from this system, but we're all in this system, right? And the system is the knowledge and power system of code, right? And of software development. And because it's enabling some people and it's restricting some people, but we're all in it, right? So the question is, and this is going into part 2, how might we change this? Because this feels like it sucks, right? Especially, I don't want to work in any more big ball of mud code bases. How can we work with code as knowledge and power explicitly so that we can make sure it works for everyone? Not now, but all the way into the future, right? So we set it up, or we fix where we are, we acknowledge where we are, and we try and make it better. And to be able to understand that, that's part 2. So let's do some pattern matching. Let's look for some patterns in how these things come about to see if there is maybe 3, next slide, maybe, it's not the next slide, 3 things about how this comes about. Not the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about now is, this book is super interesting. This book has nothing to do with code at all. It's pretty thick because David Graeber loves footnotes. It's possibly why I like footnotes. But it's a book about anthropology and archaeology. So Graeber was an anthropologist. Wengrow was so David Graeber is unfortunately dead. Wengrow was a archaeologist. They looked at the history of humanity, specifically how it organized from the dawn of humanity all the way through to now. Super interesting. What's really interesting is they point out that centralized, ossified, patriarchal, capitalist, whatever, kind of, hierarchical power structures are not the only way of distributing power. It's just that we've forgotten all of the other ones, right? There are others that have existed for thousands of years, very different places in times and places, and not just, and they do a really good job of going, yeah, but that's okay, because societies were small, or they didn't have money, or they didn't have war. There's tons of examples where all of these things happened and worked. They just didn't look like the power structures we have now, right? The problem is, we act, and again, this is a little bit of a nod to what Kenny was saying, we act as if there isn't any other way of doing this. Like, we literally act as if we want to do it. There's a really good quote, so I should definitely recommend this as well. Mark Fisher, who again is unfortunately died. Sounds even more depressing. It's irrelevant whether he's dead or not. The paper is really good. He wrote an essay called Capitalist Realism, and at the start, he's really good with these kind of quotes. He's like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. And you can, I'd like to try, but some people are like, well, obviously it's never going to change. I think if you change this around a little bit, this kind of describes how a lot of the time how we feel, right? It's easier to imagine the end of the world. It's just, these things are just how they are, right? But are they really? Right? So let's find out how these unequal power distributions arise. Because by looking at all of these different societies across all of this time and all the archaeological evidence and all the anthropological evidence, they realize that there's 3, or they propose, and this is what I'm going to steal, 3 kind of prerequisites for unbalanced power to appear. So let's look at those 3 prerequisites. 3 prerequisites. Oh, no, this is the actual side quest that I'm allowed to go on, so I'm now flagging I'm going on an allowed side quest. The reason we need to go on an allowed side quest is we need to remind ourselves what it's like to write code. So, writing code is freaking awesome, right? So it's been a bit depressing up till now. Let's be honest. We can probably all remember when we start, code is one of those few jobs where, 10 minutes, got to move fast. Code is definitely one of those jobs where lots of us would still do it if we weren't being paid, right? So it's freaking cool. It's awesome. You can pretty much do anything you want, right? And that's cool. The reason you can do anything you want is because you're on your own and there's nobody's going to get in the way, right? Then you get a job and you have to work with other people, right? And so therefore, to work with other people, we need to give up some of those freedoms, right? I can't do a gigantic pull request because we've all decided that maybe gigantic pull requests are, passive aggressive or trying to hide like some secret piece of code, right? So you need to curtail some of these freedoms. The question is, how do you decide, or how do those freedoms get curtailed, and which freedoms get curtailed, and how do you change how those freedoms are curtailed as you move into the future? Because life changes. Again, Diana's like stuff's not stopped changing and Trond again, right? We're in this world where it's the only predictable thing is unpredictability, right? So it's all going to change. How do we keep up with that, right? So, did that move? Yes, it moved. For the French people in the audience. I'm not going to say anything else. So curtailing freedom is the first center of power, right? Who decides who curtails freedom? So Wenger and Graeber I've dialed this down a bit because I didn't want it to be too depressing. They use an even worse word, which rhymes with violins. So but it's control of punishment, which is still pretty bad, right? So power sits with who controls punishment. When that sits with fewer and fewer people, that's bad. Punishment, really, Andrew? Are we really talking about punishment? Well, formal punishment for us is things like if you get hired or if you get fired, if you get promoted or if you don't get promoted, a good review, a bad review, all of these things, right? That's formal punishments. There's also informal punishments, which is a lot closer to code. So informal punishments are like comments on pull requests, right? Or whether the pull request gets accepted, or whether the pull request gets accepted faster, or whether you tell me that you don't like the fact I've used tabs and not spaces, or, right? Or devaluing of glue work. Another essay, definitely being glue, not in this talk, but read about this stuff. Like all of this stuff, these are informal punishments. The formal ones are, again, easier to spot. The informal ones end up in code a lot easier. The formal ones are like who's in which team, right? We know Conway, that ends up in code. Who accepts whose pull request first and fastest? More directly in the code, physically, right? Key fact, again, for the French people in the audience, to be very clear, organizing is not always de facto bad. May have started with good intentions. You've got to cooperate in groups. You can't just like walk in and do whatever you like, right? So there are benefits. The benefits are we all collaborate on a code base. We all ship code on time. We're not pulling against each other. We're all we don't hate working with each other. This is all important, right? So surrendering some of this freedom is cool. But when we surrender the freedom to like a certain subset to define what the punishments are and how those punishments are enacted, that's bad, right? So that's the first control. Next control, I need to move fast. Some people act as if they don't care what the control of punishment is. This is Marat. So I said I wasn't going to talk about it. I'm quite pleased with these slides. So you've worked with people there are all these rules, right? There's like how big pull requests can be, who does pull requests, etc. I'm sure we've all worked with people who act as if those rules don't apply to them. How does that happen? That's because there's a second locus of power, right? The second locus of power is maybe less obvious until you remember what we do, and you remember the whole bit of the talk that I've talked about so far. The second locus of power comes back to code because second locus of power is control of information. This is gatekeeper, Brent territory, right? Again, the control, as I've already argued, can be heavily unequally distributed, right? We know that the code is knowledge and knowledge is power, etc., etc. But it's swamp guides, it's all of this stuff, right? And if you think back, Brent is not high up the hierarchy. He becomes important to the story, but he's not high up the hierarchy in the book, right? Swamp guides do not need to be a manager, right? Swamp guides typically aren't. They're the person who doesn't want to get promoted, right? Because then that would take away, they'd be in too many meetings, they couldn't be building their swamp, tending their swamp. Right? So again, why is this important? This is important because code is so good at like hiding knowledge. We use code to hide knowledge from ourselves all the time. If I misname an attribute before lunch, I will come back after lunch and I will not understand what my code does because I can't remember because I gave it a bad name. Repeat, 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 right? I don't even need to try to build a swamp. A swamp will happen if I don't think about it, which is why naming is one of the two hard things in software, right? So we do it accidentally all the time. Code is information, and lack of it, or uneven distribution of it, is a power to prevent change, right? It's so powerful that I can write code and then leave, because I'm a consultant, so that's what I do. I can leave. The code I wrote can still be causing you problems. I can still have power in your organization, even when I'm long gone, because you don't understand what I should have explained to you before I left, right? That's bad. But given this, why don't we see all these power imbalances everywhere? So that's where number 3 comes in. So number 3, let's remind ourselves of what 1 and 2 was. Number 1, control of punishment. Number 2, control of information. The thing I didn't tell you was you only need 2 of these 3 for a power imbalance to start solidifying. You'll see these things happening all the time, right? Like new managers will come in, or like organizations will change. People will write complicated code, and then it will get fixed and refactored, et cetera, et cetera. This doesn't mean that you get imbalanced code. This is how you get imbalanced code, because individual charisma is the 3rd factor, and you only need 2, right? For the French people in the audience. He's just a guy from Corsica, right? He's not even, right? But the Brits were terrified of this guy. So, well, the Scots were maybe quite happy about it, but the English were not happy about it. So typically, charisma manifests in the hierarchy. We assume, there's a chapter in my book where I'm just like, it doesn't mean people have hierarchy, but we assume that some boss or the CTO or CEO is going to have, it's pretty painful when they don't, but we know when they don't because we're expecting them to have it. But it's not just these people, right? This is a GitHub repo, which is like Linus rants, and it's like a history of all of the horrible things Linus Torvalds has said to people. So Linus Torvalds is smart. He's also got some charisma, which lets him be I'll say this out loud, not always the most magnanimous individual. We can see it too, though, right? We can see code that's hard to change because it's opaque and it doesn't do what it says. It could be my code from before lunch. But there is also code where you see where people are scared to change it because of who wrote that code, right? Not because we can't understand it. Probably we can't understand it too. But it's like, who wrote the code? Like, touch some of the stuff that Linus wrote, and unless he likes you, you're like, some of these are, what drugs are you on? Your example is moronic. So you better be pretty, right? And when they combine, it's really hard to dislodge. Don't scroll down. It's really hard. Because I asked for one example, and someone sent me like the repo of all of this stuff. So, unequal distribution of power is a problem. Right, now I'm going to go to part 3. We're going to go fast. How do we fix it? This is the upbeat bit. We fix it by enlisting everybody, right? If we go back to a hierarchy and expect people higher up the hierarchy to pay attention to this and be aware of it, then we're going to fail, because we're all ready to go to Tron's point. We're still falling back to DP1. You weren't this bad because you weren't doing it. If you fall back in a hierarchy to fix the problems that hierarchy has created, newsflash, you're not going to fix your problems. I think like Diana had this as well, right? They're going to rebuild the same thing, right? So instead, you've got to listen to everyone. You've got to value everyone's voices. You've got to be painfully inclusive, right? Face up to stuff that Kenny was talking about yesterday. Like, people are going to have to learn about things that they aren't aware of, and it might challenge their egos. Fine. We're white, middle-class men. We can take it. You've got to be super inclusive, right? And you've got to be aware of biases, and you've got to learn and fail and all of this kind of stuff. And you've got to pay attention to this in code, and you've got to pay attention to this in how you work and who you are and everything you do. Like what food you order, which seems dumb. People think this is a big, like really crazy. It all works, but like we spend a lot of time worrying about what food we order or where we go for drinks and stuff, because certain people would be excluded if we didn't go to places everyone could go to, because it makes a difference. So how do you watch out? Part 3, 3 freedoms. Pay attention to 3 freedoms. Number 1, prizes if you know who this is. Number 1 is freedom to reorganize. Freedom to reorganize is the thing, again, related to the French Revolution. This counters the control of punishment. I'm going to overrun slightly, but I've got 5 minutes. I'm going to finish right on time. This specifies how we interrelate. We should be free to choose how we interrelate, or to suggest how we interrelate, right? The roles we play. It should be freedom to add, change, remove boundaries, right? Team topologies, right? But team topologies shouldn't just come from the top. Maybe they're rolled out by certain people who've got the time and space to do it. But if the team thinks that that it's not working, The team should be able to say, we think this isn't working, these boundaries are wrong, right? So they should, in an ideal world, contribute to Team Topologies version 2 in your organization, remap it, right? Because the world is changing, the software is changing, so they're getting amazing visibility of stuff that needs to change, right? Obviously, therefore, it comes to the freedom to refactor code. But the key thing is it needs to come from the collective. If the collective are being ignored, everybody, then that freedom is being curtailed. So when that freedom is being curtailed, signal, okay? Number 2, French Revolution. Number 2 is the freedom to move. So this counters the freedom of information. This isn't only the obvious thing, it's the freedom to leave, right? Because everyone's like, yeah, if you don't like it, you're going to leave. Right? Which is fine, but if there's everywhere else you want to go sucks equally, then that doesn't work, right? Start your own company. Okay. That's equally stupid. So, but it could be also the freedom to move from team to team, and I'm not advocating for like everybody hopping around all the time, but like you see companies where all the time where people can say, I think I'd like to be better over here, or my career would be better over here, or I'd like to do this thing over there. The key is it's to not be trapped by knowledge, right? So it might be something like setting up a task force to figure out some stuff to tackle some of these unknown code bases or whatever, right? To fix all these kind of things. But it's mainly a collective commitment to transparency. Why is it a collective commitment to transparency? Because it means that no one person is stuck somewhere because they're the only person who knows about something, which is bad. It's also an antidote to someone who's stuck somewhere on purpose because they don't want to be moved because it gives them power. Right? If you know you're like, we can't move that person. They're happy. That's probably a bad thing too. Number 3, not part of the French Revolution. Inspired by the French Revolution. So, part 3 is freedom to disobey. So this counters individual charisma. So this is the one that's a bit harder. Well, I've got quite a predisposition for anarchist and anarcho-syndicalism, so I quite like this. But some people it terrifies a bit more. But this is the freedom to like not follow common sense. If you think about it, at least in English, common sense is like the general agreement on something, but it doesn't mean it applies in all circumstances, right? It's freedom to contradict the general consensus when it makes sense. It's not the freedom to be a jerk, because that's not working in a group. Some of these freedoms need to be curtailed, but if you want to do something and it's going to go in the opposite direction to what everyone else does, but it's not going to affect anyone else and it's going to have a positive impact on the overall direction of what you're doing, that's cool. You should be able to do that if you can make sure that you've bounced all of the forces in all of the things, right? If you think back to Vlad, it's going to nicely loop back to Vlad. If you think back to Vlad, Vlad's whole point about management of knowledge is going back to DDD and team topologies. If everyone has to know everything about everything, you're not managing cognitive load, human beings can't cope. You spend all this time parceling off bits of information into separate pieces so that those teams can, as autonomously as possible, make their own decisions and do their own things. And you've agreed what you have to share. If you change something that has to share, then you need to speak to other people. If you're not, then you should be cool. So that's what freedom to disobey is. So, quick summary. Repeat for the record. Number 1, it says up here, I need to repeat for the record. Freedom curtailing is essential. I am not saying do all of these things. This is a common misconception about anarchy. Anarchy is not everyone do anything that they want. That's chaos. This is like we need to agree. We're a group of adults, like Tron said in his talk. We can figure it out, right? We're smart people. We work with code, which is flipping complicated. But whose freedoms are we curtailing and how are we curtailing them? That's what you've got to pay attention to. If we pay attention to it, right, and we value and we inquire into all of these things, we will all not only make sure that we curtail the right freedoms in the right way, dynamically and change when things change, right? We're inoculating ourselves against where this might be going and when it might go wrong, right? We're inoculating ourselves against power imbalances that can come in from anywhere. Who knows what, like, if Donald Trump gets elected, who knows what's good, right? So we need to be a bit aware of this stuff, right? Sorry. And so therefore it's good for all of us, right? This is like, if you want to be selfish, if you're like me, that means I'm, well, like a white middle-aged guy, it means better, cleaner code. That's good. That's not a bad thing, right? So it's good for us and it's good for our code, but hopefully it's good for society as a whole, right? So now I've maybe got 1 minute. You now get to vote. Do you want the happy ending or the sad ending? So happy ending, vote quickly, hands up. Ooh, sad ending. It's probably happy ending. So I'm going to see if I can speed run through both. Happy ending Andrew, this is cool. How the hell do I do this? This is an advert for my book. Buy my book. One way, and it's not as simple as this, so please watch Eduardo's talk, because you don't just do this and turns out this is how you can write a book on it. But the core of the book is this. You implement the advice process. You let anybody be able to make any decision as long as, and this is where you get the balance, they must seek advice, not permission, advice from affected parties and people with expertise in the matter. It drives better architecture because if you have to ask everyone permission for everything all the time, maybe you're a bit overcoupled and maybe you need to fix your architecture or maybe your teams aren't structured properly. So it leads, all of this stuff bleeds out, right? I haven't had the last, so I'm going to do the warning. While I was trying to avoid making these slides, Einar tweeted things while I was reading his Twitter thread. And so Einar, I don't think is here. But so, Einar tweeted, I think there's a pressure in software development towards minimizing knowledge, right? Knowledge. How little knowledge can we get away with and still build a system that seems to solve today's problem? Probably true, right? In a sense, this is just lean. Knowledge is expensive, so if we do without much of it, the better, right? Definitely, I don't want to know everything. That's hard. From this perspective, knowledge is waste. Here's the thing. If you want to see more shitposts about, pardon my French, shitposts about ML, follow Einar, he does it all the time. ML-based coding systems promise to let us leapfrog expertise, knowledge building, and build more faster with less knowledge. The problem is when it finds out we can't do without it. And this is the thing. Hopefully I've made it clear that knowledge is not just the code. The code is not just a thing that, is a binary and it runs. It represents a lot of stuff. If we're already bad at managing and representing it with all of the social dynamics, if we're using some kind of gray soup code generator, which we know has already read half of the internet and imbibed and soaked up all of the biases, we're going to let that write code for us, and then none of us understand it? So, and last point. The reason we seem to fall for this is because it can do the knowledge thing and it can do the charisma thing, because everyone thinks LLMs and ChatGPT can do everything. That's charisma, right? It can do a bunch of stuff, but we're falling into this trap. Thank you very much.